You ever had one of those mornings where you wake up to the sound of sirens and think, well, this can't be good? That was me standing on my own land watching Karen Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, for a whole 8 months, leading an armed parade of HOA enforcers right through my front gate like she was taking down a terrorist cell. I mean, lights flashing, guns drawn, the whole 9 yards. There I was forced to lay face down on the dirt my grandfather had worked since the 40s, my hands in the air, not out of fear but out of pure, blinding rage. You know what gets me? Karen strutted up with that smug look, waving an official county wildlife order in my face. She said she was saving the community from dangerous animals, but the only predator I saw that morning was her, hungry for power and the attention that comes with it. She had paperwork thick as a phone book, a security squad flanking her, and even a real county sheriff idling at the end of my drive like he'd rather be anywhere else. But what really made my blood run cold was how much Karen seemed to know every detail about the old Winchester rifle I inherited, the serial number, where I kept my ammo, and even the tools in my grandfather's desk. That wasn't public record. That was surveillance. And it made me wonder just how many times this woman had snooped around my ranch while I was asleep. I tried to keep my voice steady. Ma'am, with all due respect, we've been managing wildlife here for generations. Never needed outside help. But she didn't care. She just wanted compliance, and she wanted it now. When she took my rifle, my family's legacy, and loaded it into her SUV like it was radioactive evidence, I felt something break inside me. Not just anger, violation. That gun was more than metal and wood. It was 3 generations of sweat, sacrifice, and Sunday afternoons learning to shoot with my dad. Karen promised I'd get a receipt, told me the guns would be returned when the crisis was over. But as her SUV disappeared down my gravel driveway, I knew she'd made a mistake. She figured I was just another small-town pushover. What she didn't know is ranch folks notice things, like her emergency order being dated on a Sunday when the county offices are closed, like the signature at the bottom belonging to a clerk who'd retired half a year ago. And most telling, how there hadn't been a single reported wildlife incident in our area since Mrs. Henderson's run-in with raccoons 3 months back. That feeling of violation didn't fade. It settled into my bones, heavy and cold. But underneath there was something harder. The stubborn grit of people who know right from wrong, who've outlasted droughts and floods and city folks thinking they know better. So I decided right there in my empty garage, staring at the blank space where my Winchester had hung for 40 years, I'd find out exactly what Karen was up to and make sure she regretted ever setting foot on my land. The lie about wildlife, that's what started unraveling her whole story. When someone lies about something you know like the back of your hand, you start wondering what else they're hiding. First call I made was to Tommy Martinez, deputy sheriff, an old hunting buddy. Tommy listened to my story, and when a cop who's been your friend for 30 years tells you, we need to talk in person, you just go. We met at Murphy's Diner, the kind of place where the coffee's older than some of the waitresses. Tommy looked beat, and not from lack of sleep. From carrying the weight of something heavy. Jack, he said, those wildlife reports Karen's been filing, every one of them's a fake. He had a folder full of paperwork, dates that made no sense. Witness statements supposedly from people who'd never been on my property, animal behavior that wouldn't fool a second grader. It wasn't just sloppy, it was systematic fraud. She'd reported packs of coyotes stalking kids, rabid bears at the school, mountain lions drinking from the fountain in town. All fake. I asked why nobody had arrested her, and Tommy just shook his head. Councilman Harold Pierce had called his captain, said the HOA was doing important community safety work, made it clear that rocking the boat would put Tommy's job at risk. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just Karen. It was a system. She was the front woman for something bigger. Tommy gave me copies of her reports and a list of 5 other families, every single one forced to surrender their firearms. You know what they all had in common? Their land bordered the site for some fancy new luxury resort, a project nobody'd heard about, but you better believe developers had their eyes on. I walked the perimeter of my property that night, and what I found chilled me. Fresh ATV tracks, footprints that weren't mine or my neighbor's, and small piles of animal feed scattered around, the kind used to attract boar and deer. Someone had been setting the stage for weeks, maybe months. And not just here. That's when I realized Karen wasn't solving a problem, she was creating one. Couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the other families, my rifle, and the satisfaction on Karen's face. She thought she was running the show. What she didn't realize was she'd declared war on the wrong rancher. Next morning, I reviewed trail camera footage, Karen herself out in the woods with night vision goggles and bait, building a network of feeding trails straight toward residential areas. She was using specialized attractant to funnel wild boar toward houses, timing it so the animals would become territorial and destructive right when people felt most vulnerable. It wasn't random, it was a masterclass in manipulation. That's when I brought in Granny Rose, the retired teacher at the end of our road sharp as a tack, knows everything about everyone. Turns out Karen had been grilling her about migration routes and breeding seasons for months, supposedly for an environmental study. But Rose had also been quietly tracking property sales and insurance claims. Same pattern waves of wildlife incidents, mass sales to Marcus Webb development at bargain prices, then magically no more animal problems. Rose and I pieced it together. This was a real estate scam, and Karen was just the tip of the iceberg. I visited other towns, hit by the same scam, talked to families who'd lost everything. Their stories were all the same: fake crises, powerless cops, forced sales. The icing on the cake. When I discovered professional surveillance cameras hidden on my own property, set up to broadcast real-time footage of damage perfect for selling the danger to insurance companies and local officials. And the cameras were registered to a fake wildlife company run by Webb's nephew. Karen had created a database on every family work schedules, financials, insurance, even personal resistance ratings. My neighbors classified as moderate risk elderly. Mrs. Patterson pegged as an easy target, me marked as high resistance. But they'd missed one thing: ranchers fight back. Tommy kept digging, and what he found was even uglier. Councilman Pierce's daughter was project manager for Webb Development, and Pierce himself had stakes in every company supplying materials to the luxury resorts. This was organized crime in a cowboy hat. So I stopped fighting the boar and started guiding them, using the same bait to lure them away from residential areas and straight into Karen's perfectly landscaped neighborhood. I set up what I called a natural food corridor, making her lawns the new hotspot for hungry boar. While I was working on that, Rose found the biggest bombshell yet: Karen's HOA never legally established. Her application had been rejected months ago. Everything she'd done was completely illegal. On top of that, Webb Development had been paying property taxes on land they didn't even own, so sure of their scam, they'd left a paper trail for federal prosecutors to follow. Then came the night of poetic justice. 3:17 a.m. Karen's back lawn became ground zero for wild boar invasion. A 300-pound sow tore up her rose garden, and a 400-pound male discovered the joy of Italian leather couches. The chaos was so perfect, I almost felt bad for watching with my morning coffee. Almost. I'd called a community meeting that morning, barn packed with neighbors, county commissioners, even Tommy in uniform. I walked everyone through the footage, explained how Karen's baiting had caused the whole mess. Then live on the projector we watched as Karen tried to chase a 250-pound boar off her porch with a broom and some very creative language. That's when Tommy stood up and announced the HOA had no legal authority and that Karen was under investigation for fraud. Granny Rose dropped her own bombshell, linking Karen Webb and Pierce to similar scams in other counties, millions of dollars, dozens of families displaced. Just as things were getting heated, Pierce himself barged in, flanked by private security, trying to shut the meeting down and arrest me for domestic terrorism. But Tommy, hand on his service weapon, stood between us and announced he had a warrant for Karen's arrest. The showdown lasted seconds. Pierce and his goons retreated, chased by the sight of wild boar eyeing his luxury car. Karen tried to sue me for $3 million. The timing couldn't have been better: federal attention, media, the FBI. Within days, investigators uncovered her step-by-step playbook for land scams, interstate fraud, and a criminal conspiracy so big it took down everyone involved. Even the wild boar didn't want to leave. Every attempt to relocate them ended with the animals coming back, inviting friends, making themselves right at home in what used to be luxury lawns. Insurance wouldn't pay out. Turns out they don't cover damage caused by intentional wildlife attraction. Karen was liable for everything. Webb's empire collapsed. Pierce resigned hours before his arrest, and Sarah Pierce flipped for a plea deal, exposing the entire network. Over 5 years, they'd forced out 127 families and stolen $50 million in land until a stubborn rancher and a retired schoolteacher brought them down. And Karen, she went from queen of the neighborhood to waiting for trial in a tiny apartment above a tire shop. Her mansion repossessed, her schemes ruined. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of what used to be her house, now the Thornfield Wildlife Sanctuary. My grandfather's Winchester was back over the fireplace, the boar lounged on Italian leather, and families who'd once felt powerless were finally safe. Sometimes the best justice isn't in the courtroom, it's in the land, pushing back the community standing together and karma arriving on 4 muddy hooves. Karen tried to weaponize wildlife against us, but in the end, it was the animals and the people working in harmony who took her down. Now, before you go, let me ask, have you ever felt powerless against someone abusing authority or watched good folks get run over by corruption? Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to call out the truth and a community willing to stand up beside them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Who was really right or wrong? What would you have done, and what does justice look like where you live? Share your own story. Hit like if this hit home, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama and poetic justice.